significantly different between us and the people who mocked and tormented Jesus. They are sinners. We are sinners. They hated God, and apart from the grace of God, so would we. I assure you, had you been a first century Jew in Jerusalem that day, you would have spit on Jesus too. So Jesus will now hang until he dies, and the typical cause of death in crucifixion was asphyxiation, or shock from the exposure. Prisoner would weaken over time, eventually lose the strength to push themselves up for a breath, and this process could take days. Here again, the Romans wanted to prolong the agony, so they offered the prisoners Gatorade. No, not really Gatorade. It was vinegar to drink, but vinegar was like their Gatorade back then. So near the end, Jesus will say that he's thirsty, and he will drink a little of that then. Now, the Romans did make a concession to mercy. They offered a prisoner the chance to drink a little potion to help with the pain. In verse 34, it says they gave him wine to drink mixed with gall. After tasting it, he was unwilling to drink. So the combination of gall with the wine potion, it had this slightly anesthetic effect, which helped to cut the pain. But notice Jesus refuses to drink. And he does so because he was not supposed to avoid the pain of the cross. He was there to suffer for our sake, so he refuses to take anything that might decrease his suffering. Finally, as Jesus hangs, Matthew tells us that the Roman guards assigned to watch the prisoners that day began profiting from their work. Verse 35, and when they had crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots. And sitting down, they began to keep watch over him there. Now, Roman soldiers were often paid in spoil, either from conquest and war or from the prisoners they oversaw. Prisoners were crucified completely naked, which is how Jesus was crucified, as a further act of shame. So their clothing was left for others to take. There were multiple guards assigned to the duty that day, and each would receive something. We live in a different age of wealth. Typically, the only clothes a person had, they wore an outer garment, inner garment, a head covering, sandals, and a heavier outer coat. And all of those items had varying value. And the coat fabric, which was the most valuable, was often torn into pieces and shared among the soldiers there. But Jesus' tunic was seamless, according to John, which means it was a more expensive robe, usually worn by the upper class. So instead of tearing it up and dividing it, they throw lots or throw dice to see who's going to get it. And that little detail is in an Old Testament prophecy. For example, in Psalms 22:11, David goes from 22:11 through verse 18, and he gives this description of the crucifixion process, which David would have known nothing about what he was describing or what that experience was, because when he wrote that, crucifixion wasn't known. It wasn't invented until the Persian Empire centuries later. God was giving David and us a preview of what was coming for Jesus and doing it in a way that validated Jesus' ministry. For example, from that psalm in verse 12, it mentions the many bulls of Bashan. That would have been referring to the Roman soldiers, because a Bashan bull is pictured as a most powerful warrior or an enemy, and so that perfectly describes these Romans, and also the insults and the jeers, like the roaring mouths of lions. It says Jesus felt his life was being poured out of his body. He was scourged and beaten and nailed to the cross. In verse 14, it says his bones are out of joint, referring to his shoulders separating from hanging on the nails. His heart's like wax, in the sense he can feel it weakening and fading. His strength is sapped. Mouth is dry, his tongue sticks to his mouth. All of these symptoms, they perfectly match a crucifixion experience. In that, it says Jesus is surrounded by dogs, and dog was the Jewish preferred term to describe a Gentile, so another reference to these Romans that are around him. And in verse 16 of that, it said these same ones are responsible for piercing his hands and feet, just as the Romans did. And then in 17 and 18, it does say that none of Jesus' bones were broken, and that too will be confirmed in the gospel accounts. And so they, the dogs, cast lots for his clothing, dividing them among themselves just as we studied. And these little details are so awesome. Like, they're included in these gospel stories to point us back to these Old Testament prophecies so that we can have faith in knowing that Jesus is the Messiah. That's how God reveals himself to people, by giving us details to connect Scripture in such this cool way that we find the answers that God has hidden for us, and it also helps to build our confidence as believers. So Jesus is now on the cross, and for 3 hours he will be there for the wrath of men, and then he will experience the wrath of God, which is where we will pick up on the next episode. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. If you're feeling a little crazy and you want to support the show, you can find Just One Man on Patreon. The best thing you can do is just, maybe give a review to the show. That helps just to, get that pushed up there so that maybe other people can listen to it. Other than that, I hope you learned something new today. I hope you go back and study for yourselves for the things that you have heard here today, to test them out and see if they're true for you. But other than that, I hope to see you next week, and peace out.